this theme. To us and to many people of the interviews, we need more interdisciplinarity in our research. We need a research center, a research group that are focused on interdisciplinarity. And one way to achieve this outcome could be through weakening the disciplinary borders. From an academic point of view, in Italy, it could seem very, very difficult, but in generally speaking, or for all over the world, the disciplinary borders have to be weakened in general from a theoretical point of view. We have the point is that many people want to connect themselves with others and find spaces to share different knowledge, but with the same goal. So another remarks could be that we need a searching for interdisciplinary disciplines to increase interdisciplinarity. There are maybe disciplines that are more interdisciplinary than other disciplines. So this could be a way to increase interdisciplinarity. Other people underline that the future could be of interdisciplinarity could be in the project integration. So connect different projects already in progress in bigger projects. And a last remark we can say is that interdisciplinarity is a sort of border topics, border concept, because is in the space between generality and specialization, and these two things have to be maintained in a sort of balance. So this is very difficult, especially in the practice of research. So this is our considerations, and we want you to enjoy the workshop. And so, Luisa, we can go to the floor to the first.
Antonella.
To Antonella for introducing the first speaker of today. So please, Antonella.
Thanks. Okay, thanks a lot. And yeah, I will not going to take so long for introducing our first speaker. Just a couple of words that for me it's a kind of a pleasure to introduce Edouard Machery for this contribution, because I had the honor to be visiting fellow at the Center of Philosophy of Science, where he is the director, and so I had the possibility to appreciate how he does a great job to lead and manage the many activity of the center in Pittsburgh, where Edouard is also a distinguished professor of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. Edouard is also involved in many different projects and activities. He published extensively in various subfields of philosophy, in philosophy of biology, psychology, experimental philosophy, in philosophy of neuroscience, and he's also the author of very interesting books like Doing Without Concept or Philosophy Within Its Proper Bound. And I'm sure that much of his work is also very important for how we will see understanding interdisciplinarity, its problems and advantages. So I will not say more. I will leave the stage to Edouard directly. So please, Edouard, thanks for being with us, and the stage is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Antonella, for this really nice and kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for the invitation and for listening to me today. Let me try to share the screen first, make sure it's working well. Oops, that was not what I wanted to do. Let me try again. Ah, yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, very good. Antonella, it's working fine, correct?
Yeah, it's great. We are
all
seeing.
Right, good, wonderful. All right, so what I want to talk about today is about an issue that was just mentioned earlier in the introduction, which is the fact that when you bring people from different disciplines, you are often lacking a common language, and that's going to be the topic for discussion. So, as I just said, I will be focusing today in this talk about a specific challenge which is raised by interdisciplinarity. And the challenge, I like to put it as this way, the following way: what should collaborators coming from different disciplines do when the scientific concepts they use are understood and assessed or evaluated differently across disciplines? So if you take people from ecology, philosophy, and computer science and put them together, and if some of the concepts they happen to use are understood in different manner and assessed differently, what should they do? Is that a failure, or is that something, is that an opportunity? So that's going to be the question I will examine in this talk. So the question again is, do polysemy and disagreement about the validity of a scientific concept call for conceptual reform? And that's what philosophers would call conceptual engineering. Now, why is that an important question? Well, it's an important question because there is a presumption in, I think, much of philosophy of science, but also sometimes in science itself, that good scientific concepts we should have are those that elicit consensus about, first, their meaning. They should be univocal and not polysemous, and second, their validity. Right? And concepts that elicit a dissensus, a disagreement, either about meaning or about validity, are in some way deficient concepts. And so there is this presumption that when we have a concept that elicits dissensus, polysemous concept, or dissensus, disagreement about validity, these concepts are invalid or are poor scientific concepts and maybe concepts to be reformed. And as I will be arguing, and as I'm sure most of you know, in an interdisciplinary concept, we are often in such a situation, right? We're often in a situation where dissensus and not consensus is the rule. But as anyone who has actually looked both at contemporary science, but also at the history of science knows, the meaning and validity of many scientific concepts are unsettled. So concepts are often polysemous within and across disciplines, and their validity is often, for a very long time, a matter of debate. Second, scientists often don't seem to mind. Scientists seem to be living very happily with polysemous concepts, despite this ideal of having univocal concepts. And third, this state of affairs might be functional. It might not be simply a side effect, a detrimental side effect that scientists learn to live with. More interesting, it might be a functional state of affairs. Dissensus about the meaning of concept, namely polysemy, and about the validity of concept might be actually one of the wheels that allow for scientific progress. So that's some of the ideas I want to be engaging with in the rest of this talk. And just to summarize the point I'm going to try to be making in the next less than 30 minutes is that apparent deficiencies, so seeming problems or seeming deficiencies of scientific concepts in an interdisciplinary context, such as polysemy and disagreement about the validity of these concepts, can in fact contribute to scientific success. They're not obstacles, they're not mere side effects we should learn to be living with. They in fact can contribute to scientific success, and particularly in interdisciplinary contexts. That's going to be the idea. So we should not always strive to remedy or to improve the polysemy or lack of agreement. We should sometimes actually learn to exploit it. So that's some of the ideas I want to discuss. So the talk will be looking at, will be organized in 3 sections. The first thing I will mention, following up on the introduction that was given earlier today, is I will discuss some of the most obvious challenges of interdisciplinarity, and I will give some case studies based on my own interdisciplinary work. Then I will move to the notion of an uncentered concept, and I will contrast uncentered concepts with the ideal of clarity that comes from philosophy of science, but also that's very common in science. And then I will argue that uncentered interfield concepts are often scientifically useful, and that's particularly the case in an interdisciplinary context. So let's start with some of the challenges of interdisciplinarity. As was mentioned in the introduction and in my own introduction, an important source of difficulties in interdisciplinary work comes from the diversity of methods, norms, expectations, beliefs, and concepts from collaborators, among collaborators from different disciplinary backgrounds. So when you put together people who come from philosophy, psychology, anthropology, economics, they are bound to bring different tools to do science, different expectations about what good science looks like, different beliefs about what the world is, and also different concepts. And often it's not always easy for all these people to talk to one another. And in fact, I think this diversity is obviously the main source of difficulties, of practical difficulties for doing useful and efficient interdisciplinary work. And in my own interdisciplinary work, I've met the difficulty again and again. And I will give you one example here to get us started. So for now a few years, I've been one of the 3 PIs of this very large project called the Geography of Philosophy. It's a John Templeton funded project. It's a multi-million-dollar project. It was started in 2007. Funding started in 2018. It was supposed to be over earlier this year in May 2021, but it's been extended until the end of 2022. It's a more than $4 million project. If you're interested, you can have a look at our website, at our Facebook page, or follow us on Twitter. We also have a blog. It's led by myself, my frequent collaborator, Steve Stitch, who is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist at Rutgers, and Clark Barrett, who is a cognitive anthropologist and an evolutionary anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. And we're working with more than 100 people all over the world. So in addition to the challenges of interdisciplinarity, to which I will turn in a minute, there's also the challenges of cultural diversity here in Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, North and South America, and also in a range of cultural settings from large-scale urban centers like Beijing and Delhi to small-scale societies like the Amazonia in Peru and Ecuador. And what we want to know in this project is to try to get a sense of what people mean by the concepts of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom across cultural settings. So the reason I'm mentioning this project is not simply to advertise my work, obviously, but more importantly, because the project is thoroughly interdisciplinary. And it's been for me an occasion over the last few years to think about interdisciplinarity, both from a theoretical and practical point of view. It's interdisciplinary in the sense that it involves, among others, the following disciplines: philosophers, so 2 of the 3 PIs are philosophers, and a few of the team members, 100+ team members are philosophers. Anthropologists, 1 of the 3 PIs is an anthropologist. But in addition, within the discipline of anthropology, we have some cultural anthropologists and some evolutionary anthropologists. And if you know anything about anthropology, you know those disciplines or sub-disciplines are extremely diverse. They don't agree about much. We also have some economists. The leader of the Ecuadorian team is an economist. We have some linguists. 2 of our postdocs, a former postdoc and the current postdocs, are linguists. We have some neuroscientists. The leader of the team in South Korea is a neuroscientist. Some psychologists, obviously. We have 1 geographer. The leader of the team in Morocco is a geographer, and some computer scientists. And on top of that, we have a poet. The leader of the Indian team is a poet. all these people, of course, as I mentioned earlier, have brought different methods, tools, expectations, concepts, and beliefs to the table. So we've had to deal with the issue of diversity. And this issue of diversity has manifested itself in tons of different ways. Just to give you a single example, it's manifested itself when it comes to what methods to use. So the project is really based on using tools and methods from social psychology. Mostly, we give people some very simple stimuli, often vignettes, but sometimes videos, and we ask for very simple answers to questions in response to these videos. And then we analyze this question quantitatively using some statistical tools. So it's a very experiment-based methodology. And in our team, we've had to negotiate that methodology extensively and to modify it throughout the project, largely because some of the team have a different background. They come either from linguistics, where they want to look at corpus, including at real linguistic exchanges, or they come from cultural, some ethnography and cultural anthropology, where they think that the type of experimental methods we use are actually poorly suited to study concepts in many cultural contexts, for example, in small-scale societies. And they've been pushing us to do some ethnographic interview-based studies rather than quantitative experimental vignette-based studies. So we've had to negotiate the diversity of accepted methods within the teams. And that's an issue, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with. But what I want to be focusing on today is not so much the issue of what people take to be the relevant methods, but the issue of the diversity in the concepts people have brought to bear within that team. And diversity has taken two main forms. On the one hand, what is known as polysemy, and polysemy just means that a given concept has two overlapping meanings. It contrasts with univocality, or the idea that a concept has a single meaning, but also with ambiguity, where a single word, like bank in English, has two unrelated meanings. So in the case of polysemy, for example, book in English, the meanings, the diverse meaning of this word are not unrelated to one another. So the word book in English can mean both a physical object, like this one, and an object you can download from a PDF a file that you can download from internet. Right? The meanings are obviously related to one another, but they differ. So that's one form of diversity within an interdisciplinary context. A given word or a given concept may mean different things to different people within that team. And there's also another form of diversity, which is the assessment of the validity of a concept. Some concepts that are fully accepted and taken to be fully valid within one discipline can be taken to be, at the very least, challenged in another discipline, if not fully invalid. And the two are interestingly related. Often, diversity in validity assessment is partly rooted in a polysemy. People can have different take on the validity of a concept because they don't quite mean the same thing by that concept. So let me give you an example that was and still is a live example in my own project, and then I'll turn to the more theoretical part of the talk. So the Geography of Philosophy project, as I described it earlier, is meant to study variation of philosophically relevant concepts such as knowledge, understanding, and wisdom across cultures. So the concept of culture is our main independent variable. It's our main explanatory variable. Right? We want to know whether people, for example, in Asian cultures, in East Asian cultures, tend to conceive of wisdom differently from people in, for example, Western cultures, or whether people in small-scale societies tend to conceive of knowledge differently from people in large urban societies, which are economically integrated. So that's the culture here is really one of our independent variables, and it's one of our main explanatory variables. In that, we follow in important traditions and disciplines within science. So in psychology, there is this subfield of cultural psychology, illustrated, for example, by Dick Nisbet's work. Nisbet is one of the advisors of the project, and illustrated by his work, The Geography of Thought, that takes culture to be an important explanatory variable to make sense of diversity in thinking throughout the world. There is a theoretical work on cultural evolution, where culture is there, again, an important explanatory variable. And finally, in experimental philosophy, one of the fields I work in, culture has also been an important explanatory variable. So as we take that concept of culture that's so important for our project from existing disciplines or sub-disciplines. And in those disciplines, that concept is roughly univocal, and it's settled. Its validity is by and large accepted. However, for some of the other members of the team, that concept is contested. And in fact, the validity of the concept of culture, while it might seem obvious to me as an experimental philosopher and someone steeped into cultural psychology, it's actually rejected by mainstream cultural anthropology. So many mainstream cultural anthropologists view the concept of culture as, at the very least, problematic and as probably unusable to do very serious work in anthropology. A very nice book recently on the matter is Anthropology Beyond Culture, that summarizes the recent debates about that, but the debates really have a 50-year-long history in cultural anthropology about that notion. So we end up here with a concept that's about which there is no consensus within our own interdisciplinary team. For some of us, it's a totally fine, acceptable explanatory variable. For others, it's actually a problematic, contested concept, even for them, an invalid concept. As I mentioned earlier, this dissensus is partly rooted in polysemy. One of the reasons why we don't agree on that, on the validity of this concept, is because we don't quite mean the same thing. For cultural anthropologists in the team, the concept of culture often means a totalizing system that is identified to national boundaries and that is imposed in a passive manner on community members. So all French people are supposed to be sharing the same set of values, norms, behavior, and that maps well with the boundaries of France. And that concept is rejected. For me, the concept of culture is quite different. It's an abstraction. One can characterize at some level of abstraction commonalities that are shared by many, if not all, French people. And in fact, there will be diversity among French people, and people are the passive recipients. They can play with their identity. But it's still the case that at some level of abstraction, there are some commonalities that are worth paying attention to. So the diversity here with respect to the validity of the concept of culture is partly rooted in the polysemy of the concept of culture across disciplines. That tension, and that's going to be a theme for the rest of this lecture, has been extremely fruitful. It's been extremely productive in the team. The fact that there was disagreement about the explanatory status and the validity of the concept has led us to actually look for additional and maybe more explanatory variables. And that's going to be the theme for the rest of this talk, right? The idea that when we have an unsettled concept, a concept about which there is dissensus and not consensus, both about its meaning and about its validity, rather than trying to get rid of this dissensus, it's often a source for successful scientific research. All right. Now I want to move from this case study to a more abstract characterization of the same issues. And the existence of dissensus, both about the meaning and the validity of concept, goes against what I like to call the ideal of clarity. The ideal of clarity is very important in philosophy of science, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. It's very important in Carnap's work right after in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So Carnap defines the job of a philosopher of science as turning unclear concept into clear concept. That's what he called explication. But that's an idea that's found throughout the first half of the 20th century. You have a quote here from the sociologist Max Weber, who talks about the importance of sharp and unambiguous concept. The physicist Bridgman, one of the most influential physicists for science and also for philosophy of science, also talk about the importance of having a set of operations that avoid any ambiguity. And if you look at Karl Popper's work, you'll find a very similar idea. So there is idea that good concepts should be clear. They should have a single explicit meaning, and there should be consensus within a community about what this concept amounts to, how to use it, what are the implication of using it. And that's a very plausible idea. Concepts that are not clear often comes with cost. having a clear concept prevents some fallacies, it prevents miscommunication, and more important for philosophers of science, it allows for severe testing, right? If you have a concept that's not clear, that's often polysemous, testing is never going to be severe because any results, many results will be accommodated by playing with the vagueness and of the concept. So clarity of concept allows for severe testing. Nonetheless, what I like to call unsettled scientific concept violates the ideal of clarity. A concept is unsettled just to the extent that there is no consensus about its meaning, its correct use, or its validity. So unsettled concepts are going to be polysemous within a given community. People are going to mean different things, creating some vagueness about the proper use of that concept within a given scientific community. And there will be no consensus about its validity, about when to use it and how to use it, and about what we can learn from using it. Now, unsettled concept violates the ideal of clarity I just described, right? Because what the concept mean will be unclear across users of this concept. And what we can learn from it, its validity, will also be unclear. Nonetheless, despite the fact that unsettled concepts are actually violating a plausible and influential ideal in philosophy of science and in science itself, the fact is that many scientific concepts are unsettled within disciplines, to say nothing of across disciplines. So polysemy and the lack of consensus about the validity of scientific concepts are extremely common in science, even within discipline. And you might think, well, maybe that's true, but it's only going to be true of those scientific concepts that are at the margins of science or that are not central for scientific progress. But in fact, historians of science have shown, I think, in a pretty decisive manner, that some scientific concepts that have been central to some of the greatest scientific discoveries of the last 2 centuries, and particularly of the last centuries, are in fact unsettled concepts. They're polysemous, and their validity is unclear and debated. I think the best example, the one for which historians of science have done the most work, is the concept of gene. I don't have the time to read this long quotation from Reinberger here on the right of your screen, but Reinberger has made, I think, a very compelling case, and with him many historians of biology, that the concept of gene means very different things across scientific disciplines. In biophysics, in biochemistry, in molecular genetics, for those interested in evolutionary biology, and for developmental geneticists. Just to give a hint of what that means, for molecular genetics, the concept of genes is really related to its molecular structure. For evolutionary biologists, it's going to be really related to its function. And the two can be at odds with one another. There's much more complexities than what I'm suggested right here. But the important point here is that we have a central concept that is unsettled. Remember, unsettled just means there is no consensus with respect to its meaning. It's a polysemous concept, and with respect to its validity, to what we can learn from it. But the important idea is not simply that some concepts are unsettled, even some central concepts are unsettled. The important idea is that the success of these concepts, the reason why they've helped scientific progress, is because they are unsettled. It's not despite the fact that they're unsettled. And I think Reinberger, in his work, has really argued for this view that we should actually not try to clarify some of these scientific concepts, but rather we should understand how their lack of clarity, and in particular the fact that they are polysemous and that they are contested, in fact, contributes to their usefulness in a given scientific field. Here's a quotation from the book I mentioned. Let us take this as a lesson about the dynamics of science, instead of accusing the actors, namely the biologists, of being careless in defining the entities they work with. And following Reinberger, there is in History and Philosophy of Science a research project looking at those other concepts that are also unsettled in that sense, that are polysemous and that are contested, and looking at how their polysemy and the debates around their validity contribute to their usefulness, rather than stand in the way of their usefulness. A nice paper is a work by Neto quoted here on the right of this slide, and it focuses on the concept of biological lineage to make a very similar point as Reinberger. All right, so what we've seen here is that interdisciplinarity often results in unsettled concepts, polysemous and contested concepts, that it violates a very natural and very commonsensical ideal, the ideal of clarity, but that unsettled concepts are first common, they are central to very successful research projects, and there's a claim made that they are central to this successful project because they are unsettled, because they are polysemous, and because they are contested. All right. What I want to do in the last section of this talk is to try to spell out this third claim, right? Why would unsettledness be a tool, be a contribution to scientific utility, all right? And then once we have put some flesh on this idea, I will come back to the issue of interdisciplinarity, of unsettledness in interdisciplinarity. All right. Unsettled, so let me introduce the notion of an interfield concept. So an interfield concept is a concept that's going to navigate, so to speak, if you allow me the metaphor, is going to be used in different scientific fields. It's going to be found, for example, in neuroscience and in computer science. It's going to be found in economics, in anthropology, and in philosophy. So that's concepts which are used in many fields, and they're not simply used in many fields independent from one another. They circulate across the fields. They allow these fields to talk to one another. Right. Unsettled concepts, so concepts for which there is no university, so they are polysemous, and no agreement about their validity, they are contested. Unsettled concepts promote good science. They don't simply stand in the way of successful science. When dissensus comes from the fact that they are interfield concepts, when lack of agreement about their meaning and validity results from their use across fields. And why is that? Well, interfield concepts have these properties that they allow the flow of explanatory practices, methods, research questions across diverse fields. Right? It's essential for the point of interfield concepts is that one idea, one method, one strategy, one explanandum that's found in one field can move to another field. That's their function. It's to allow the navigation of scientific, what I will call, for the sake of simplicity, scientific information across scientific fields. Interfield concepts play that role, and they can play that role because they are unsettled. That's a crucial idea, and that's an idea that has been formulated by Reinberger among others. So I think it's important to analyze the source of this idea. So how is that supposed to work? We're supposed to work as follows. Each field or research tradition provides its own specification of the unsettled concept. So within a field or within a subfield, concepts are settled. As I mentioned earlier, in cultural psychology, the concept of culture is settled. There is a rough, fairly univocal meaning of the concept, not fully univocal, but fairly univocal, and the concept its validity is widely agreed upon. So within fields, concepts are settled, but across fields, they are unsettled, right? So each field is going to settle the concept in a specific way by fleshing out its meaning, by specifying its meaning with greater precision, by associating the concept with experimental practices, operationalization, explanatory schemes. But across discipline, this specification will be quite different. As I mentioned, the concept of culture is specified differently in cultural anthropology, where it's a target, and in cultural psychology, where it's an explanatory variable. And that will result in polysemy, and as a result, possibly in disagreement about the validity of concept. But by being formulated by means of the underspecified concepts, right, the fact that it's specified in a discipline, but also underspecified across discipline, the finding explanatory schemes can be detached from their original settings and as a result exported across fields, right? We have a same concept, it's polysemous across field, but because it's still used across field, despite the polysemy, the original findings within a field with a settled concepts can be transported across field. All right, so the existence of this unsettled concept allows for the flow of information. Another virtue is that these concepts are flexible. They can be modified in light of scientific changes, right? Because they're unsettled, because they're polysemous, because there is no agreement about their validity. They can be transformed in light of the dynamics of science, and they preserve their identity. And of course, science is fundamentally a dynamic process. There are constant technological, empirical, and theoretical changes. So we want concepts that are not settled. We want concepts that remain flexible. And I think that's one of the reasons why unsettled concepts for which there is no consensus within a field about their meanings and their validity, happen to contribute to the success of science. All right, so that was the third idea, trying to flesh out how unsettled concepts can be useful. They're unsettled concepts because they are interfields, and they allow the meanings to move. They allow scientific information to move across field, and also to respond to the dynamics of science by being flexible. Okay, these ideas now allow me to go back to interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity often involves concepts that are unsettled across disciplines, as I mentioned earlier with a case study of the concept of culture in my own research project. And that manifests in two different ways, polysemy and unclear validity. And undoubtedly, polysemy and unclear validity comes with risks. That's why the ideal of clarity that Carnap, Popper, Weber, Bridgman have articulated in many ways, that was that ideal is so plausible. So there are risks coming with unsettledness. However, while unsettledness clashes with the ideal of having clear concepts, the ideal of clarity, it is often an asset for scientific projects. It's an asset when you have a need for interfield concepts, for concepts that allow the flow of scientific information across disciplines or subdisciplines, as well as for flexibility. And I think that was the history of science. Both older science and also contemporary science has shown to some extent. And I think the crucial idea here is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because there is an urge when we are in an interdisciplinary context to fix the meanings of terms, to agree within people coming from, to agree about the meaning of some scientific concepts between people coming from different disciplines and bringing different understanding of scientific concepts. And I think we should resist that urge, right? We should resist the urge to fix what appears to be broken, but what in fact is not really broken, and may contribute to the success of science by allowing flow of information, flow of scientific information, and flexibility for scientific research. So the advice here, the practical advice coming from this, from the history of science, and also for thinking about the role of polysemy and ambiguity in science, is that we should actually learn to exploit ambiguity rather than to try to fix it. The idea of precision that comes from philosophy of science might actually be a mistake for dynamic and life science. All right. Thank you for your attention. I think I've used my 30 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Edouard.
All right.
Rose in a virtual way. So we can very fast, because I know that Edouard at a certain point has to leave us for going to teaching. Yeah. And so maybe you have already questions to ask him. Please, Federica.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Edouard. So, thanks so much for this presentation. I think it's great. I'm very sympathetic to Rickman's work in physics. And so my question is more about how do we empirically assess whether allowing for this pluralism of meaning is really fruitful to science. So for instance, I'm working on biodiversity, and biodiversity suffers from this polysemy.
Yeah.
And so being biodiversity the object of conservation biology, you don't know whether a conservation strategy has been successful, because if you cannot measure exactly what biodiversity refers to, how can you even think that you're doing a good job? So I was wondering whether you have like any thoughts on this issue, and whether you think that when we talk about quantifying concept, there might be an exception to this rule of allowing for polysemy.
Yeah, it is a great question. So I think there's two different ways of, so I thought that so two different ways of understanding your question. The first one was how to assess the claim in general. And I think history of science here gives us a way to really provide evidence supporting the idea that polysemous concepts have been actually extremely useful and fruitful for the growth of science. So I think that's one aspect. But I think your question is actually much more precise. In a given context, how do I know whether in that context I should actually tolerate diversity and polysemy, or rather I should try to correct it, and particularly in light of the need for measurement of some of these concepts. And I think that's a genuine challenge. My take about, and I don't have, I wish I had a how-to, a very concrete, practical how-to guide to sell you. I don't. But nonetheless, here's what I want to say. If you look at the case of gene, what you have is that within subdiscipline, you have precisification going on. Right? So it's not like the concept of gene is very vague, let's say, within some research tradition in molecular biology. Quite the contrary, people have actually clarified what they mean by gene, allowing intron and extrons to be part of the ways they understand genes. So within subdiscipline, people are actually willing to precify the concept, associate those concepts with very precise personalizations. But they don't impose those personalizations to other tradition within biology. They're totally happy if people in developmental biology conceive of gene in a slightly different manner. And I think that's somehow the advice is you must specify. There's no other way of going on about doing empirical works and operationalizing your concept. I think this is totally true. But I think the mistake is to want to reduce the concept you're using to that specific operationalization in that specific scientific concept. So that's what I would want to suggest is you want to have the best of both worlds, right? And that's what Reinberger described. I mean, it's very clear. Look, concept of gene really precise in some tradition, really vague across subdisciplines. So you want to be able to combine the best of both worlds. It would be my so I don't know how helpful it is on a concrete point of view, but I think it does suggest don't impose your operationalizations on other members of your interdisciplinary group.
Yeah, so I agree with you, and thanks for your answer. I have a follow-up, but I think there are other people in the queue.
All right, cool, thanks.
Okay, maybe we can let Marco ask the questions, and then maybe we can come back to you. Marco, you are muted.
Okay, go for it, Antonella.
You're still muted. Maybe you can just open the microphone.
Yeah, that's smart. Sometimes, the Occam razor. So, thanks, Seth, for the nice talk. I have totally a priori, say, kind of objection. Now, I might agree that not achieving a full consensus, unified operationalization of a given concept might be fruitful. But to me, that does not necessarily imply that we should not strive and keep that as a regulatory ideal. Why? What I mean is that it might be that the usefulness of conceptual polysemy and vagueness and whatever, I agree it's fruitful, might bear its fruit precisely because there has been some clash. So the attempt, albeit it can never be reached, can be a sort of carrot to pose in the front of the proverbial donkey face. We try to get there, we never actually go there, but clashing, I have some examples in the case of emotion, but I leave it for another time because it will take too long. So the whole idea is, why should we just continue to keep on with this delusion to achieve just for the sake of promoting fruitful and funny debates and struggles between proponents of different concepts?
Good. No, that's. I think that's it's an excellent question. Good to see you too. It's it is really an excellent question. It's a tricky question to address. On the one hand, one might think, look, this a norm of specification can have serious detrimental consequences to science. It can push people to endorse definitions which are stipulative and actually are preventing the flexibility that I think matters a lot. So on the other hand, you're quite right that clashes are in fact one of the main reasons why the polysemy is productive, because people are confronted with one another and say, oh, you mean this, oh, you mean that. Let's try to clarify a bit what we mean. So the concept of culture in the GPP is exactly what happened. You know, when we just realized, look, you people don't want culture as an experimental variable. We want culture as an experimental variable. Let's try to sort out a little bit where that comes from, and then that led us to include actually more sophisticated explanatory variables and just this very broad, abstract, and admittedly artificial. So I think it is true. But here's what I want to say. It's not quite clear to me that to get those clashes, we need to have the ideal of clarity, because I think polysemy is just part of any language. So my view is that polysemy is the way any language works. It's there's no non-artificial language, and even some artificial languages that does not bear polysemy. And as a result, in our everyday practice, we used to clarify the meanings, to meet people who don't quite mean the same thing, and to engage into this metalinguistic negotiation as philosophers have been. So I'm not quite sure we really need this ideal to get into the stage where there's this friction between groups. It's to some extent an empirical question for the historian of science, right? And I think the case of emotion you mentioned is a great case study where we do have exactly this polysemy going on. I mean, as you know, better than I do, since you've been working on the matter quite recently. But so the question is, yeah, the clashes is exactly where productivity, fruitfulness happen. Do we need the ideal of clarity for this clash to be happening and fruitful? Here I'm a little bit less convinced, largely because scientists, I'm not sure they care that much for clarity, actually. You know, in my experience, often they're totally willing to live with unclear concepts. And they tell you things like, look, these semantic debates, I couldn't care less, and so on and so on and so forth. It's a very common attitude toward what we philosophers try to impose on them, a requirement of clarity. So I think that's really an excellent question about could that play a fruitful role in science? And you know, I tend to say no, but I open for looking at the history of science more carefully here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a quick question because it could also be a follow-up of the first two questions. I also wanted to ask you what you think about clarity as a regulative ideal, but in a kind of different way, because I was making an analogy between what is happening in the field of multiple determination, triangulation, when there is discordance or non-convergent of evidence, and how unification is taken to be a kind of, or concordance and unification, a kind of regulative idea, but in a more local and modest sense. And it means that we don't expect the field of science to be completely coherent, to give exact the same results, but just to be able to connect the results produced by different methodologies or by different approaches to the results from other, so obtained with other approaches. And the convergence or the unification, at least at the local and modest level, act as a regulative ideal, because when things do not work or do not converge, scientists go on with their investigation till the point of things become less contradictory, at least. And I wanted to ask you if at least we can use this kind of local and modest concept of clarity as a regulative idea, unless of one more absolutely.
Yeah, no, this is really two useful comments from a slightly different perspectives, but and I think it's not incompatible with what I said, it's an interesting complication about what I said, where polysemous and unsettled and contested concepts are actually useful in science, but they're useful. That doesn't mean there is not a role for this ideal of clarity. That also has a role to play for some aspects of science in some context. Yeah, so that's you know, you could see how somehow you'd have science being a very dynamic, complex process. You'd have different factors contributing to a successful science. On the one hand, scientists would be pulled toward greater clarity. On the other hand, because of their specific scientific niche, they would be pulled toward diversity, and the diversity could be fruitful in other ways. And maybe it's actually these two poles that allow for useful scientific progress. So it's an interesting idea. I'm not, you know, it's to some extent an empirical question in the sense we want to look at the history of science and look at contribution of that ideal in specific historical episodes to, you know, it could be the older history of science, but also science in the making that you were alluding to, as looking at nice case studies where there could be a fruitful tension. I think tension is maybe the right metaphor here, between the ideal of clarity and the intrinsic diversity of different scientific niche and the unsettledness that results. I don't have, you know, I don't want to stipulate the answer, because I think that's a really more complicated picture as you're painting, but the one that's really, really interesting. I myself have always been resisting a little bit the unification idea. So I think I'm more leaning toward diversification as being actually very useful and often bringing its own rewards. But there might be, again, variation across parts of science where trend pushing toward diverse clarification, integration has actually been another pendant of these dynamics.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Francesco, do we have time for a very, very quick question from John, or do we have to go to the next speaker?
We should go to the next speaker, unfortunately, because we have
That's
okay.
For
fine.
so maybe we are 10 minutes late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edouard. It was
Thank
very
you.
great.
Now I'm going to go and teach. So I have to leave you. I'm sorry to be unable to stay for the rest of this workshop, but my graduate seminar starts in 6 minutes. So
Okay, bye, and thanks.
Bye, guys. Take care. Ciao.
Sorry, John, I hope you are not mad at us for this, but I hope you will enjoy the next speaker. So, Vienna, I'm going to introduce Bianca Vienni. I'm going to introduce you, and you can share the slides for your presentation. So it's my great pleasure again to introduce Bianca Vienni Baptista. She's a senior researcher at the Interdisciplinary Lab in Zurich, Switzerland, and she works in the field of science, technology, and social studies, and focus particularly on the study of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. So his work is very interesting and important for the theme that we are going to inquire today. And I think you are having some problem for sharing the slides.
No, hello everybody. I just wanted to thank you for the invitation, and now I will share. I just wanted first to, appreciate the invitation to this workshop. Can you see my slides?
Yes, thanks a lot. So I will give the stage directly to her, and she will talk directly to us about interdisciplinarity and share interdisciplinary practices. Thanks, Bianca, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So my presentation will focus on interdisciplinary practices, and specifically I will speak about a recent Horizon 2020 project in which I have been involved for the last 3 years, that it is entitled Shaping Interdisciplinary. Sorry, there's a bit of background noise. The project is entitled Shaping Interdisciplinary Practices in Europe, where 7 partners around Europe, we have studied basically what means and what implies to do interdisciplinary research and teaching in Europe. And what we have done for the last 2.5 years, this is a support action, and we wanted to specifically address the problem that has been identified also by the Commission, the EU Commission, that in inter and transdisciplinary research, there's a gap still on how integration is being done between the arts, humanities, and social sciences and the STEM disciplines, meaning the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, as we put it in our project. So as part of the outputs we have envisioned, we have a set of recommendations that are directly set for the Commission and specifically for funders and policymakers who are trying to promote and foster inter and transdisciplinarity, but also a toolkit and a kind of guidelines to better improve interdisciplinary practices according to the specific features that I will share with you in 1 second. So our project works what it is called in the literature already in 2000 and defined as the paradox of inter and transdisciplinarity, that on one side, ID is really promoted at the policy level, is sometimes used as a buzzword because it is integrated within different schemes and different funding structures. But then on the other side, it's very poorly encouraged and rewarded at the institutional level. Some universities are not really following or fostering this type of collaborative research or teaching. And so this disbalance, this tension is what we specifically address, as I said, in this project. And sorry, there. So what we have tried to do as a main aim of our project was to disentangle the terms and the definitions, and specifically we were focusing on the understandings and the factors that in a sense are affecting or influencing collaborative research in different European settings. And for this I will focus my presentation today on 2 main questions. One is how the scientific and the policy discourses are defining and characterizing inter and transdisciplinarity. This because as it was said, the terms are polysemic, but also they are influencing the practices and influencing, as I said, the policy and the funding schemes. And also, what are the implications of the different understandings in these terms, specifically because these understandings also influence the factors of success and failure, what we researchers conceive as a failed or as a success in practicing, in delivering inter and transdisciplinary research or teaching. So what have we done very briefly in this project to achieve to show you a bit of the outputs? These were done basically in the first term, performing an extensive literature review, but also a survey among researchers practicing inter and transdisciplinarity in Europe. We also then developed 6 learning case workshops in 6 different cities in Europe to jointly explore, not only with researchers, but also with stakeholders, what were their understanding, their obstacles, their the difficulties they were encountering when developing ID and TD. There's also from these 2 steps, we develop a knowledge framework. So we worked in a sense with the concepts, and we tried to classify them in a sense that better reflect these different understandings, this polysemy, if I can use the term. And last but not least, as I said, a toolkit was developed as the final output, and this toolkit is already available, and it contains, as I said, a set of recommendations, but also practical tips and guidelines to further foster interdisciplinary research. In terms of the survey, so we basically work with projects that are in the European, funded by the European scheme. We basically worked with 41 that were interesting for us because they were focusing on the AHSS, Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, with the STEM collaborations. We wanted to better understand what was happening there. And we elaborated a list of 25 factors that they conceived as hindering or helping interdisciplinary collaborations. And in this sense, I am summarizing in this slide, which are the main factors, the ones that were most voted by these researchers as the biggest obstacles to develop interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary projects. One of them was the lack of mutual learning, and I've already said this before, between researchers, but also funders and policymakers. There's a tension there, a gap where researchers are putting a lot of time, a lot of effort to develop interdisciplinary research, but on the other side, funders and policymakers are not really accounting for that effort, or the funding schemes are not always tailored to the needs of an interdisciplinary team. Also, this is related to the previous one, thus the lack of appropriate funding. And also very important, it was a very heavy factor was are the assumptions about other disciplines or the mutual ignorance, meaning that some researchers working with other disciplinary representatives do not really understand or conceive what the partner is doing or how the discipline is developing a certain method or a certain tool. And last but not least, it was also mentioned, and it's also a very important aspect in interdisciplinary practices in Europe, is the career path. So how many of early career researchers are developing an interdisciplinary career, but they are not really having institutional support or the adequate supervision to do that. So the two of the factors that I am focusing now is this lack of mutual learning and the assumptions on other disciplines. So as I said, part of our work was to try to disentangle and understand the different understandings. And now I start of what are the findings in terms of the academic discourse. What does the literature, the scientific literature, understands for inter and transdisciplinarity? So the different understandings are contested, and this was said already in the previous presentation. And they are mostly contested because they denote a spectrum of experience, but these experiences are also heterogeneous. So it's not only at the level of the concepts that we can see that there's a difference, but also within the practices, what different researchers conceive or how different researchers proceed to develop as an interdisciplinary setting. This is also imposing an important level of heterogeneity. So for these reasons, me, myself, and the group I lead is basically looking at the terms as from a problematization perspective. So we do not consider them as given, but rather as historically and geographically contingent. And I will explain now. The differences that you can find within the terms, within the different understandings of interdisciplinarity, are, on one sense, due to differences among countries and communities. So on the first place, I can give you an example in terms of the German-speaking countries as Switzerland or Austria, for instance, and some Nordic countries where they mostly use the term transdisciplinarity when they are dealing with this type of research that is basically co-producing knowledge with stakeholders. But for example, in the UK, the term transdisciplinarity is not used at all, and rather they use interdisciplinarity, and they explain that they are also working with the stakeholders. So here you can see a big difference between terms. There are also important differences within and between the disciplines. So there are disciplines that totally believe on interdisciplinarity, but are in a sense relegated from the discussion, as in the case of the geographers, because some of the concepts that they use and the methods they employ are co-opted, are already taken from, for example, natural scientists. And so geographers feel that, as we have checked, they are not always involved in the discussions about interdisciplinarity. From the point of view of archaeology, the term is used in a different way because archaeologists are, according to the findings of our study, are working to try to interdiscipline their own discipline. But this does not mean that they are looking forward to collaborating or integrating concepts with other disciplines. And there's also a heavy differences in terms of terminology. There are authors who do not use inter and transdisciplinarity as terms, but rather they use co-production or cross-boundary work, as in the latest book by Julie Thompson-Klein, but they have a similar meaning. So there's also great differences in which are the terms or the concepts we use to express this collaborative work. So how to find a bit of a pathway within this heterogeneity? In the literature, there are usually consensus about that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity need the process of integration, and that they have or they pursue different purposes. And this is why we can speak of 3 different discourses on inter and transdisciplinarity. The discourse of transcendence, it's mainly that one that it's trying to sort out the boundaries between disciplines and trying to find a unified or a common ground among all disciplines. And so you can find many definitions of interdisciplinarity and many authors in Europe working from this perspective of transcending disciplinary boundaries and finding a common language. And interdisciplinarity is mainly related to this perspective. Nevertheless, there's a second discourse, and this is also very powerful discourse in Europe, where interdisciplinarity is mainly focusing on problem solving. And here again, there are differences among understandings, but this discourse, in a sense, integrates perspectives where interdisciplinarity is a means to an end, and it will help to solve certain complex problems. And last but not least, there's also a discourse that it's focusing on transgression. And in this sense, interdisciplinarity would be a critique, a fundamental critique, what it was said in the introduction, these colleagues of yours who are perhaps thinking of interdisciplinarity as philosophy might perhaps be into this, put into this group. So in this case, we are talking about transgression of knowledge systems, of educational systems, and as I said, a critique that involves a transformation, a radical transformation. So this was until here how the academic discourse, the scientific discourse understands interdisciplinarity. If we if we look at how the policy discourse is dealing with the term, we will find that mostly the policy documents, reports that are developed in Europe, and also, as I said before, the funding schemes are usually considering the term interdisciplinarity with a unique understanding. A unique understanding that it is mainly related to the idea of interdisciplinarity to solve problems. So the second of the three discourses I explained before, and also related to societal challenges research. And this is why I bring here the pillars from Horizon 2020 and Europe. It's also related with the SDGs. So this idea of interdisciplinarity from the policy discourse is mainly rooted in the need for missions and the need for accomplishing and approaching, coping with grand challenges. So these complex problems that I mentioned before. Some examples from the policy literature that looks forward to having one understanding is, for example, this one from the ACOLA report, where they are looking for a parsimonious classification of different kinds of interdisciplinary research, because indeed funders also find it very difficult, the fact that they are dealing with heterogeneous and diverse practices when they try to find a common understanding of ID. And also this by the Digital Science in 2016, where they were also arguing for a much greater clarity on definitions. Some reports, as the one by Leroux, by European universities, have also tried to implement definitions coming from the scientific discourse. So there's, in a sense, this tension I was speaking about before. It's also trying to be breached in a sense. So in Leroux, they are using a very well-known classification of multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity by Julie Thompson-Klein. And here you can see again in these arrows, these associated actions to inter and transdisciplinarity are taken from these authors. So they are, in a sense, reproducing and trying to already find certain clarity within these three terms. So what this implies, so why this is a problem, that there are on one side multiple understandings, and on the other side, on the policy side, there are mainly seeking for only one definition of interdisciplinarity. There are three sets of implications. One of them is that, of course, researchers try to frame their problem and research questions according to one established way of doing interdisciplinary research. And this, in a sense, is a problem because it does not really allow for innovative perspectives or new ways of adapting methods. This is specifically due also because the problem-solving discourse is, as I said, the powerful one. So, for example, the critique or the transcendence of boundaries are usually less funded or less represented in proposals. It's also influencing the fact that inter and transdisciplinarity do not achieve their full potential in the scientific realm because they are poorly understood or badly supported by the policy sector. So, as I said, this thrive for innovative methods and tools do not really find a way through funding, and so they cannot really flourish. And last but not least is that policymakers and funders that are really following only one understanding of interdisciplinarity are reproducing the paradox that I mentioned at the very beginning, causing this tension and this gap, especially that some disciplines are not well represented as arts and humanities in collaborative research. They are not really taking a leading role or are not really part of the big projects and proposals that are funded. So to finalize my presentation here, I also leave a couple of questions that are the ones that we are mostly working in the team, that has to do how to deal with these differences, but also how to develop a dialogue, a conversation that really accounts for the current state of knowledge, specifically in interdisciplinary knowledge, and how does contextualism or this acknowledgement of heterogeneity can bridge the gap or help scientific communities to work together and to be more committed to interdisciplinarity. As I said before, my perspective is that a problematization of concepts is needed, and it's well-founded or grounded into the evidence that I have shown to you. And basically because when we disentangle the terms, when we try to understand what inter and transdisciplinarity are considered, we need to keep in mind that for some researchers, ID and TD, or especially interdisciplinarity, is an object of conceptual and empirical investigation. So this is something that we are looking at as an object of study. So in this case, we really need to co-create concepts. We really need to maintain the flexibility that was also mentioned by the previous presenter. But for other researchers, they are using and implementing interdisciplinarity as a method of working. So in this sense, what it is needed from our perspective is a traceability of processes. So because the way you develop the methodology within your project will change and will vary, so there's a need to trace these processes in order to create a learning process also within and among different projects. And then it's also important to, as I mentioned before, to keep in mind that interdisciplinarity is subject to historical and geographical variation. And one way to, in a sense, approach this variety and heterogeneity is mapping understandings, as it was already said, to really acknowledge these differences and work towards them as an asset. So, from my perspective, and agreeing with what is already been said, heterogeneity of understandings, or this polysemy, it's an opportunity for change, mainly because it constitutes, as I said, something that really represents the variety of practices that are developed in inter and transdisciplinary settings. There's no one model where we can all develop the same integration process, for instance. It's also because it allows us to give this mapping of understandings, this co-creation of concepts I mentioned, and allowing for more transparency in definitions, for more accurate definitions within these contexts. And at the same time, simultaneously, it allows for informed best practices and models. That it's also something that interdisciplinary research and teaching is needing. So it's also this learning loop that I was saying before, trying to get the best of the practices we implement. And also it helps to the consistency and alignment between activities, practice, and theory in a systematic approach. So this is one of the policy briefs we have done, we have developed in the SHAPE-ID project, where we specifically address as a recommendation for the EU this aspect of taking into consideration that there is a variety of definitions and understandings, and to encourage greater participation from arts, humanities, and social sciences. We really need to engage these different ways of doing interdisciplinarity and these different ways of understanding what interdisciplinarity means. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to receive your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, and sorry if we are a little bit out of time. I hope you can stay with us answering the questions. Let's open the Q&A session now. Is there any questions? Yes, Luigi.
Antonella, sorry, did I stop sharing? Yes.
Yes, you did.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Luigi, do you have a question, please?
Yes, thanks, Antonella. Thanks, Bianca, for your intervention. It's very interesting. And I was wondered if you have received some feedbacks by policymakers or about your proposal, and what are the other guidelines you have elaborated after this mapping?
Yes, there's two questions, right? in your comment. Yes, thank you, Luigi. Indeed, we have discussed this. As I said, we did 6 workshops with policy makers and funders around Europe. And what we try to do is to, in a sense, change the mindset. So here is a tension, as I said. On one side, you know, calls and programs need a very specific clarity on the definition. But from our perspective, this is not really fruitful, because then researchers need to, in a sense, force their practice and force the problem they are dealing with into a definition that it's not really making sense for them. And it was already, I think, in a sense, mentioned in one of the questions before. So for funders and policymakers, what we suggest is to allow for calls that the researchers or the consortiums can, at the beginning of a proposal, decide on which definition or understanding of interdisciplinarity are they willing to use, or is it useful for their project. And we have done some work and further workshops, and we are still pushing the Commission, the EU Commission, for this to be one of the recommendations that we have suggested that can also help to overcome the problem that, as I said, there are disciplines as arts, well, arts and humanities especially, and some social sciences that do not really have a space because they do not work with certain definitions of interdisciplinarity. They don't find a place in interdisciplinary consortiums. We also had the opportunity to participate in some of the preparatory meetings when they were discussing the Horizon Europe scheme. And if you look at the new program, there are some slight changes that we think that are very important, especially in the transdisciplinary aspect. So the idea that you can work, and it is promoted and supported that researchers work also with other societal actors, stakeholders. But there's a lot of work to still be done. But yeah, that was part of our project, was to try to push the discussion into that sense.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And John, James, do you have a question?
Thank you very much for that very informative lecture. I did have a question of elaboration on some of those geographical variations that you spoke about, particularly the difference between the for-profit model that kind of exists within the English-speaking world, and how that might compare to continental Europe, particularly in terms, of course, in trans and interdisciplinarity, because it could be framed as possibly that the for-profit model would either be a hindrance or perhaps a benefit to interdisciplinarity. My initial guess would be that it could be a hindrance, but maybe I'll be incorrect. Particularly as often in the for-profit model, there's what's sometimes called market Stalinism. Now you need strong measurable outcomes, and maybe that's very difficult to kind of to combine that with a flexibility between the departments. So I wondered if in your research you come across something like that, or you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. That's thank you for your question, John. That's totally correct, as you said. So there are other tensions that, due to a matter of time, I could not go into, but they are related to the understanding tension. So on one side, the UK has in the past worked with a more specific definition of interdisciplinarity, as I said, but I think that especially the funders in the UK have a long trajectory. They have a lot of experience, because UK was one of the first countries, I would say, in Europe that have adopted measures towards interdisciplinary research, and they have very interesting also funding schemes in the national level. So from this point of view, I think it's more, as you said, some aspect that might benefit, for instance, because we have a lot to learn from English funders, for instance. I think that this also is true in other countries in continental Europe. This is big differences. I just put that one on the slide to call attention. So I think that the matter can be solved in terms of transparency, as I said, and in a way trying to acknowledge what is the way you understand the term and how it is better suited for the proposal you want to develop. And in terms of measuring and research output, now there's a lot of discussion, and also we have we work with colleagues from University of Edinburgh, and we have very interesting discussions in terms of the ref that you have just changed a few months ago. And there's still a lot to do there. So in terms of research evaluation, interdisciplinarity is still a delicate matter. There are not really good schemes or indicators or guidelines to do that. There's still a lot to be discussed. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Sorry, I was not able to click on the microphone. Thanks a lot. Is there any other question? It seems that we have no question for now. I will let Luisa, she wanted to add something or have a message for us.
Yes, I will.
Luisa, you are muted now. We are not listening to you.
Luisa is arriving.
Yeah.
Okay.
The main computer.
Yes, I would like to thank our speakers and thank all you to be present and to
remind the second.
Next meeting is on 18th of November. More on the
some case
practical,
studies. Yes.
Some case studies on interdisciplinarity. So some ERC project 1 or two, yes. So some good practice, successful practice on this topic. If you would like to be update to this, please follow our website of the Knowledge and Cognition Center, where the updated program will be published.
Okay. So thank you very much to our speakers,
everybody, yes.
And see you again the next
Thanks
meeting. Thank you, Antonella, for your chair session. And so, goodbye to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Bianca.
Thank you.